Welcome to a tale about one of the most chilling mysteries in Appalachian history. Tell us your location right now, because this account will touch you in ways few stories can. We're diving into a puzzle that lasted for generations, hidden in West Virginia's mountains, where two twin sisters broke every rule society had and created a darkness so terrible that history tried to erase them completely. The year was 1932. The Great Depression was choking America with invisible fingers, destroying hopes, and dragging whole families into desperate poverty. In the Appalachian mountain areas, things were even worse. Between fog-covered mountain tops and deep valleys where sunlight barely reached, people lived cut off from everyone else. No paved roads connected these tiny towns to bigger cities. The paths were dirt, muddy for months at a time, and traveling anywhere meant walking for days or riding wagons pulled by tired mules. West Virginia has always been home to tough people, shaped by coal mining and barely getting by on small farms. The mountains keep secrets unlike anywhere else in America. Caves exist that nobody has ever fully mapped, canyons where sounds vanish completely, forests so thick that even at noon they feel like eternal dusk. In this place, Ruth and Ruby were born, twin sisters who would turn into a dark legend whispered in bars and around fires for decades. They came into the world in McDowell County, an area famous for its deep mines and people who learned early how to survive on almost nothing. The year was 1914, when World War I was starting to hurt Europe. But there, in those far-off mountains, the outside world felt like another universe. The twins grew up in a rough wooden shack built beside a stream that rushed down from the heights. Their father dug coal like nearly every man around. Their mother kept a small garden and a few animals that gave just enough to keep them from starving. From the beginning, Ruth and Ruby were different from other local girls. While most girls learned sewing, cooking, and got ready for early marriage and raising families, the twins liked wandering mountain paths, exploring spots the locals stayed away from. Neighbors said there was something in their eyes, a weird brightness, a sharpness that made people uncomfortable. They didn't speak much, but when they did, their words carried a disturbing heaviness. By age 18 in 1932, the twins had become almost mythical in that region. Stories swirled about them. Whispers passed along on freezing winter nights. People said they knew every hidden mountain trail, every secret cave, every shortcut that saved days of travel. They also said the twins had an almost supernatural bond, that they could speak without words, that they sensed when one was in danger, even miles apart. But darker stories circulated too. Travelers moving through the area started vanishing. Not many, maybe 3 or 4 yearly, but enough to create a worrying pattern. They were always outsiders, people who didn't know the mountains and got lost on trails, wandering traders, workers hunting for mine jobs, drifters with nowhere to go. Some thought the mountains simply swallowed these folks, that accidents happened, that falling into a canyon or getting caught in sudden storms was easy. Others, though, started eyeing the twins suspiciously. The McDowell County Sheriff back then was William Hargrove, a war veteran who returned with an injured leg and tired eyes. He knew every family around, every secret the mountains tried hiding. William knew the twins were unusual, but unusual didn't equal criminal. He needed real proof, solid evidence. And in the Appalachian Mountains, proof was scarcer than gold. In May 1933, a cloth seller named Thomas Whitmore disappeared. He was traveling from Charleston, West Virginia's capital, bringing goods to sell in remote mountain towns. Thomas was known for always taking the same route, stopping at the same places, treating customers well. When he didn't show up in Welsh, where he usually spent the night every third week, people worried. His horse turned up 3 days later wandering alone on a trail near where Ruth and Ruby were often spotted. Sheriff Hargrove put together his search party. He gathered 20 men, some with tracking dogs, others with flashlights and ropes. They searched around the trail, where they'd found the horse. The mountains were dangerous that time of year, with frequent rains turning ground into slick mud. After 5 days searching, they discovered some of Thomas's stuff scattered near a rock formation locals called Raven Rock. There were torn cloth pieces, an empty leather bag, but no sign of the trader. That's when someone mentioned seeing the twins in that spot the very day Thomas vanished. The witness was a hunter named Edmund Price, a quiet man with a strong reputation. He swore he saw Ruth and Ruby talking to someone matching Thomas's description, near a trail crossing a few miles from Raven Rock. Edmund said it seemed odd because the twins rarely spoke to strangers, but right then they appeared friendly, even welcoming. The sheriff decided to question Ruth and Ruby. He rode to their cabin with 2 deputies. The cabin was more run down than he remembered, with loose boards and a roof partially covered with tops. The twins met them on the porch, looking identical, but with something in their eyes that sent shivers down even tough men's backs. They denied meeting any trader. They claimed they'd been hunting that day, looking for rabbits and squirrels to eat. There was no way to prove different. Sheriff Hargrove's investigation hit something he knew well: the silence of the mountains. In Appalachian communities, people had an unwritten rule of protecting each other, a deep mistrust of outside authorities. Even when suspicions grew, even when rumors spread in taverns and on porches, getting someone to officially testify was nearly impossible. People feared payback, feared becoming the next victim, feared breaking family bonds that stretched back generations in these isolated places. William Hargrove wasn't stupid. He understood Ruth and Ruby came from a well-known family in the area who, despite crushing poverty, had connections through their father's mine work. The miners formed their own brotherhood, united by daily dangers deep underground. Accusing a miner's daughters without hard evidence could create problems the sheriff wasn't ready for, especially when the law barely reached these forgotten corners. But William kept at it. He started reviewing old cases, disappearances filed away as accidents or people who just moved on and never returned. In the dusty counter records, stored in wooden boxes in a damp basement smelling of mold and old paper, he found records going back to 1928. At least 9 people had disappeared near trails cutting through territory the twins frequented. 9 people in 5 years. All traveling alone, all from outside the area, all without close family to push for more investigation. The pattern was disturbing. Disappearances always happened between April and October, when trails were possible and travelers ventured into the mountains. During harsh winter, when snow and ice made passes nearly impossible, no disappearances were recorded. This suggested something beyond simple natural accidents. The mountains were just as dangerous in winter, maybe more so. But it was exactly during this season that nobody disappeared without explanation. William decided to try something unconventional. Instead of confronting the twins again, he started quietly watching them. He asked Edmund Price, the hunter who'd seen them with Thomas Whitmore, to keep track of their movements. Edmund knew these mountains like his own hand, knew how to move silently, could read tracks and signs most people wouldn't notice. For weeks he followed Ruth and Ruby from a distance, noting their patterns, places they visited, times they left and came home. What Edmund discovered was both fascinating and creepy. The twins had an almost ritualistic routine. They always left the cabin before sunrise, when mist still covered valleys like thick ghostly sheets. They followed side trails, avoiding main paths where they might meet others. They had specific spots where they stopped, places that seemed to hold special meaning. One such place was a natural cave on the north side of Mount Pinnacle, a formation standing like a dark guard over the surrounding landscape. Edmund never got close enough to the cave without risking detection. The twins were incredibly alert, turning their heads at tiny sounds, stopping suddenly like wild animals sensing danger. But he noticed they'd carry canvas bags into the cave and come out hours later with apparently empty bags. What were they hiding inside? What did this place conceal in its damp, dark depths? In August 1933, another disappearance shook the area. This time it was a young man named Marcus Payton who worked as a surveyor for a Charleston company interested in mapping possible areas for mining expansion. Marcus was 23, known for being thorough and always submitting detailed reports. When he stopped communicating, the company sent 2 men to investigate. The men found Marcus's camp abandoned, his equipment scattered messily, as if he'd left in a rush. His compass lay broken on the ground, maps torn, notes partially burned in a dying fire. There was something violent about the scene, something suggesting struggle or desperation. One of the company men was a war veteran and recognized the signs immediately. This hadn't been an accident or voluntary abandonment. Something terrible had happened there. Sheriff Hargrove was called again. This time he arrived with 6 deputies and fresh determination. The scene was unsettling. Among Marcus's belongings, they found a journal where he recorded observations of the region. The last few entries were especially intriguing. Marcus had written about meeting 2 women in the mountains, identical twins. who offered to help him map certain hard-to-reach areas. He described the sisters as having deep understanding of the terrain, able to guide him through shortcuts that would save days of work. The last diary entry, dated 3 days before they found the abandoned camp, read, "The sisters invited me to visit a cave they say contains amazing rock formations. They said few people know about this place. I'll leave with them tomorrow at dawn. I'll finally be able to map the northern region of Mount Pinnacle accurately." After that, nothing. Blank pages. Complete silence. Now William Hargrove had something more solid. The diary was evidence directly connecting Ruth and Ruby to Marcus's disappearance. But proving what really happened remained the problem. He knew he needed to enter that cave, see for himself what the twins were hiding there. But doing so without proper preparation would be suicide. Appalachian caves were deadly mazes with deep drops hidden in darkness, passages that narrowed until impassable, chambers where poisonous gases built up without warning. The sheriff recruited 3 experienced miners, men used to working underground who knew how to spot dangers and navigate safely in tight spaces. He also brought extra flashlights, strong ropes, and each man carried a gun. They didn't know exactly what they'd find, but they were ready for the worst. Edmund Price would guide them to the cave entrance on Pinnacle Mountain, using his detailed knowledge of trails and the twins' routine. They set out on a September morning, just as autumn was starting to paint leaves in shades of red and gold. The air was sharp, almost cold, and morning mist created a ghostly feeling among dark tree trunks. The hike to Mount Pinnacle took 4 hours, climbing steep slopes where they had to grab roots and rocks to keep from sliding. The group stayed silent, communicating only with hand signals, alert for any sign the twins might be nearby. The cave entrance was hard to spot, partially hidden by bushes and a rock formation creating a sort of natural doorway. Without Edmund's knowledge of where to look, it would have been easy to walk right past the dark opening leading into the mountain's belly. William Hargrove turned on his flashlight and signaled for the others to follow. The cave's inside was damp and cold, with limestone walls that glowed faintly in the flashlight beam. Water drops fell from the ceiling at irregular intervals, creating a rhythmic, disturbing sound echoing in darkness. The group moved slowly through the cave, their flashlights throwing dancing shadows on uneven stone walls. The smell was wet earth mixed with something else, an odor the miners recognized immediately, but chose not to name. The starting passage was fairly wide, allowing 2 men to walk side by side, but it soon began narrowing, forcing them to walk single file. The ceiling gradually lowered, making them lower their heads and then bend over almost completely. William Hargrove felt the mountain's weight above him, tons and tons of rock seeming to press down on the air around him. He wasn't afraid of tight spaces, but there in that narrow tunnel with total darkness waiting beyond the dim reach of flashlights, even a brave man felt the first hints of panic trying to creep into his mind. He took a deep breath, forced himself to stay calm, and kept going. The miners behind him seemed more comfortable, used to such places, but even they kept serious, watchful expressions. After about 30 minutes of difficult walking, the passage suddenly opened into a huge chamber. The ceiling rose so high the lantern light could barely reach it, creating a sense of vastness and pressure at once. Stalactites hung like stone spears, some so long they almost touched the floor, where stalagmites grew in weird formations. Water flowed somewhere nearby, a constant sound of dripping and flowing filling the heavy silence. That's when they saw the first signs of human presence. There were marks of old fires on the ground, circles of blackened stones surrounding long-dead ashes. Pieces of torn cloth were scattered throughout the chamber, some already rotted from humidity, others still recognizable as belonging to clothing travelers would wear. One of the miners found an old moldy leather boot, the kind traveling traders used for long walks. William approached one of the chamber's walls and raised his flashlight to examine it closer. There was something carved in the stone, deliberate scratches forming symbols he didn't recognize. They weren't letters from any alphabet he knew, but primitive drawings, stylized human figures in pairs, always in pairs, connected by lines suggesting some kind of connection. Between these figures were other symbols, shapes seeming to represent mountains, caves, or perhaps something more abstract that escaped rational understanding. Edmund Price, who'd stayed near the chamber entrance keeping watch, called to the others in an urgent whisper. He'd found something that made even the seasoned hunter take a few steps back. In a natural dip in the ground, Partially hidden by a rock formation, lay a collection of personal belongings. Empty leather wallets, rusty pocket watches, rings and chains, coat buttons, knives of various sizes, even glasses with broken lenses. It was a macabre collection, trophies kept as reminders of something terrible. Sheriff Hargrove felt his stomach turn. Here was the physical evidence he'd been hunting for, concrete proof connecting the cave to the disappearances. But there was something even more disturbing about the discovery. The deliberate organization of the objects, the care with which they'd been arranged, as if they were part of some ritual or ceremony understood only by the twins. It wasn't the chaos of violent, uncontrolled crime, but the cold order of something planned and repeated over and over. One of the miners, a man named Joseph Carter who'd been working in the depths since age 15, pointed to a side passage opening into the far wall of the chamber. The opening was low and narrow, barely visible in dim light, but a noticeable draft came from it, showing it led somewhere deeper into the mountain. Joseph said circulating air meant another exit, or at least a larger chamber beyond, but it also meant any sound they made could travel through these passages and alert anyone exploring other parts of the cave system. William made a decision. 2 men would stay in the main chamber, guarding the entrance and cataloging evidence found. He would lead Joseph and another miner through the side passage to explore what lay beyond. Edmund Price insisted on coming along, arguing he knew the twins' habits better than anyone and could anticipate their movements if they appeared. The sheriff agreed, and the 4 men prepared to go deeper into the mountain's belly. The side passage was narrow, forcing them to crawl in some sections, pushing their flashlights ahead, pulling themselves up with their elbows over damp, rough stone. The air grew thinner the farther they went, and everyone began feeling growing pressure in their ears. Joseph explained in whispers they were descending, likely following a natural fault cutting through the mountain at a downward angle. He warned them about gases, which in deep caves could build up without warning and kill a man in minutes. After what felt like forever crawling in darkness, the passage finally opened into another chamber, smaller than the first, but with clearly different characteristics. The floor here was more uneven, covered in loose boulders making balance difficult. But what caught their attention most was what they found in the chamber's center, a structure made by human hands, a sort of altar built of carefully stacked stones forming a raised platform about 3 feet high. On the altar lay more objects, but these were different from the trophies found in the previous chamber. Here were arranged scraps of stained cloth, small bones appearing to be from animals, twisted branches arranged in geometric patterns, and in the center of it all, a dark leather-bound book, so old the pages seemed ready to crumble at the slightest touch. William Hargrove picked up the book with extreme care, holding it like a bomb about to explode. The book's pages were covered in faded ink and elaborate handwriting ranging from readable to completely incomprehensible. There were passages in English, but also passages in other languages William didn't recognize. Drawings filled the margins, detailed illustrations of human figures, always in pairs, always twins, surrounded by symbols echoing those carved on the first chamber's walls. Some pages contained what looked like records, dates written beside names and brief descriptions. With shaking hands, William leafed through the book, searching for something that made sense, something he could use as understandable evidence in court. He found a page dated 1928 with a name he recognized, Henry Aldridge, a hardware salesman who'd disappeared that year. Beside the name was a brief note, taken to sanctuary. The mountain accepts. We are keepers of the covenant. Other pages contained names matching disappearances William had investigated in the county records. Marcus Peyton was there, dated August 1933, with the note, "What maps will be mapped? The mountain claims its secrets." Joseph Carter, examining the altar more closely, found something hidden in a crack between stones. It was a smaller, more recent journal, with a still fairly new leather cover. He handed it to the sheriff, who opened it with fresh caution. This journal was different, written clearly in modern English, with handwriting that alternated between 2 subtly different versions of the same hand. William realized each twin wrote on alternate days, keeping a shared record of their thoughts and actions. The most recent entries were disturbing in their surface-level normality. Ruth had written about the weather, about plants she'd found on trails, about a dish she'd seen drinking from a stream at dawn. Ruby had written about dreams, visions of mountains that breathed, of stones whispering ancient secrets in forgotten languages. But among these everyday and poetic entries were vague references to visitors, those who come from outside, those whom the mountain chooses. William Hargrove kept reading the diary with a mix of fascination and growing horror. An entry from Ruby, dated June of that year, read, "The mountain chose us before we were even born. Mother always knew, but was afraid to speak. She told us about grandmother, about great-grandmother, about all the twins who came before, always in pairs, always guardians. We didn't choose this path, but it chose us, and to refuse it would be to betray the blood running in our veins." This suggested something far beyond isolated crimes, something spanning generations, a dark tradition passed from mother to daughter across decades or perhaps centuries. Edmund Price was restless, pacing back and forth across the chamber, constantly glancing back at the passage they'd entered. He knew the twins, knew they visited these caves regularly and could appear any moment. If they were surprised here, in this stone maze, where Ruth and Ruby had every advantage of knowing the terrain intimately, the results could be catastrophic. He quietly suggested they take the diaries and other items as evidence and leave immediately. But William was determined to explore further. There was another passage leading from this second chamber, even narrower than the previous one. Joseph Carter examined the opening with his flashlight and said the air coming from it was different, more humid, with a strong mineral smell showing running water nearby. Underground rivers were common in this part of the Appalachians, flowing through channels carved by erosion over thousands of years. Some of these rivers emerged in springs on the surface. Others disappeared into deep sinkholes, never seen again. Against Edmund's advice, the group decided to press on. The passage was so narrow they had to take off their coats and leave them behind, crawling on their bellies over cold, wet stone. Their lanterns created a claustrophobic effect of light and shadow, playing with depth perception, making it seem as if walls were closing in. The sound of rushing water grew louder, a muffled roar vibrating through solid rock. When they finally emerged into the third chamber, the sight waiting for them was both beautiful and terrifying. An underground river cut through the cavern from side to side, its black swift waters flowing forcefully through a channel carved into rock. The chamber was vast, its ceiling disappearing into darkness beyond their flashlights' reach. Giant stalactites hung like stone curtains, and the water's sound created a deafening symphony of echoes. But it wasn't the river or rock formations that took the four men's breath away. On the opposite bank of the river, partially visible in dim flashlight glow, stood a structure clearly not natural. It looked like some kind of construction of stacked stones forming low walls enclosing a rectangular space. Within this space, even from a distance, it was possible to see stomach-churning shapes that were once human, but that time and the cave's conditions had transformed into something almost unrecognizable. Joseph Carter, with his experience in underground environments, quickly assessed the situation. The river was too deep and swift to swim across, and there was no visible bridge or passage. But he noticed higher up, where the chamber narrowed, large rocks formed a sort of irregular path across the current. It would be dangerous. The rock was slippery from constant humidity, and a fall into those icy waters would mean certain death, swept by the current into the mountain's unknown depths. William Hargrove knew he had to reach that structure, had to see for himself what was truly there. He couldn't return to the surface and mount a proper investigation based only on guesswork and distant glimpses. The sheriff began moving carefully toward the rocks crossing the river, testing each step before transferring his weight completely. The others followed, keeping safe distance from each other, so as not to overload any individual stone. The crossing took 15 minutes of absolute tension. At any moment a rock could give way or a foot could slip, sending any of them tumbling into turbulent waters. The river's roar was deafening there in the middle of the crossing, making any verbal communication impossible. When they finally reached the opposite bank, they were all soaked in sweat despite the intense cold of the cave, and their hands trembled, not only from temperature, but also from fear they'd suppressed during the crossing. Up close, the structure revealed its true macabre nature. Stone walls enclosed an area roughly 10 by 13 feet. And within this area was what could only be described as an unofficial cemetery. There were no coffins or headstones, but the remains of at least 7 people laid out there, each set of bones arranged with disturbing care. Decaying clothing still covered some of the skeletons, allowing them to be identified as belonging to different eras, some obviously older than others. Among the remains were carefully placed personal objects, as if they were offerings. Pocket watches, wallets, rings, religious medals, even eyeglasses positioned where eyes of long-lost faces would have been. The arrangement had an undeniable ritualistic quality. Each body placed in the same position, facing the same direction, with hands crossed over the chest in a mockery of proper burial. Edmund Price pointed to something carved in stone on the structure's far wall. Using his flashlight to better illuminate it, he revealed an inscription in Old English, letters carved deep into rock. Here lie those the mountain claimed. May their souls nourish the ancient roots. May their silence keep the sacred secrets. Guardians we are, guardians we will be, until other twins come to replace us. The inscription was ancient, clearly made decades, perhaps even a century earlier, suggesting Ruth and Ruby were only the latest in a line of twin sisters continuing this dark tradition. Joseph Carter was examining the bones with a professional eye, trying to determine cause of death and approximate time of death. He pointed to fractures in several skulls, marks consistent with blows from heavy objects. Some ribs showed signs of trauma, broken by violent force. But most disturbingly, none of the bodies showed signs of being dragged or handled carelessly. On the contrary, despite obvious violence of their deaths, the bodies had been transported and arranged with almost loving delicacy, as if the killers felt some kind of reverence for their victims. William Hargrove forced himself to mentally catalog every detail, every piece of evidence he could use later. Among the skeletons, he identified items of clothing matching descriptions of some of the missing: a woolen jacket with brass buttons worn by Thomas Whitmore the draper, a leather vest that had belonged to a wandering blacksmith who disappeared in 1930, boots with distinctive markings matching old missing persons records. But there was something else in that chamber, something only noticed when Edmund moved his flashlight, exploring shadows beyond the burial structure. In the far wall, partially hidden by a formation of stalagmites, was an opening leading to a fourth passage. Unlike the others, this one appeared to have been partially worked by human hands, the edges of the opening bearing tool marks, as if someone had widened a natural crack to create a more accessible passage. Joseph Carter approached the opening and examined the markings on stones. He said the work was ancient, made with primitive tools, probably decades old. Whoever had carved this passage had knowledge of stonework and had devoted considerable time to the project. The opening was large enough for a person to pass through while stooping, and from it came a draught smelling different from the rest of the cave, an odor of earth and rotting vegetation suggesting a close connection with the surface. The group hesitated before that fourth passage. They were already deep within the cave system, far from the original entrance, and every minute spent their increased risk of being surprised by the twins. Edmund Price was visibly nervous now, his hunting instincts alerting him to dangers they might not yet see or hear. He argued they already had enough evidence, that they should turn back while they still had the chance. But William Hargrove sensed they were on the verge of discovering something fundamental. The final piece explaining not only the recent crimes, but the entire dark history stretching back generations. They entered the carved passage, moving with fresh caution. The walls here showed clear signs of human work, smooth surfaces where natural stone had been carved, regular notches serving as handholds and footholds in steeper sections. The passage rose gradually, contradicting the steady descent they'd experienced thus far. Joseph Carter explained they were likely following an ancient access route, perhaps created by past prospectors or explorers who discovered these chambers and decided to make them more accessible. After about 20 minutes of ascending, the passage opened into a smaller chamber, but this one was fundamentally different from all the others. It wasn't a natural formation decorated with stalactites and stalagmites, but rather a room carved into living rock with relatively flat walls and a low uniform ceiling. And within that room were unmistakable signs of prolonged and recent human occupation. Blankets were rolled up in a corner. Metal pots hung on hooks on the wall. Wooden crates were stacked with groceries and other supplies. A rough table made of unfinished planks held melted candles, more leather-bound journals, and various objects seeming to have been collected over years. The walls were covered with drawings and writings, layers upon layers of marks telling a visual story of obsession and ritual. William approached the table and began examining the diaries displayed there. They were older than those found in the previous chamber, some with leather covers, so worn they crumbled to the touch. He opened one carefully and saw the first page was dated 1873, 59 years earlier. The handwriting was elaborate, the kind cultivated by educated people of the 19th century. And the text began, "My sister and I came to these mountains following the whispers of blood. Our mother taught us before she died, just as her mother taught her, going back to times long forgotten. We are the guardians, and this is our sacred burden." Other diaries revealed similar stories, different twins at different times, all recounting versions of the same central story. They were chosen from birth, raised to protect some ancient secret of the mountains, taught that certain travelers needed to be taken to sacred places where the mountain claimed them. The descriptions varied in detail, but the core remained constant through decades. There were mentions of ancient pacts, promises made before white settlers, responsibilities inherited from the first peoples. Edmund Price drew the others' attention to something on the walls. Among the drawings and writings was a more elaborate panel, clearly created with more care and intention than other markings. It was a kind of family tree, but rendered in a unique way. Instead of branching upward, it descended vertically, with each generation represented by a pair of connected circles symbolizing twins. The tree began at the top with symbols that weren't English names, but characters seeming to represent concepts or titles. Moving down the wall, the symbols gradually gave way to names, Sarah and Susan, then Martha and Mary, then Elizabeth and Eleanor, and so on until reaching the bottom where it was written in still relatively fresh ink, Ruth and Ruby. Joseph Carter counted the pairs of circles on the family tree. There were 17 generations represented there, 17 sets of twins over a period that, if each generation lasted roughly 30 years, would stretch back over 500 years. This would place the origins of this tradition before European colonization of the region, perhaps even in indigenous practices somehow absorbed or mixed with beliefs brought by later settlers. Sheriff Hargrove realized he was dealing with something much larger and more complex than simple murder. This was a tradition, a family cult persisting through centuries, adapting and surviving through social change, war, and the passage of time itself. The twins weren't simply criminals, but practitioners of something they genuinely believed to be a sacred responsibility, a duty transcending human laws and ordinary mortality. But understanding the motivation didn't change the reality of the victims. Men had died, families had lost loved ones, and all of this in the name of a belief that, however ancient and deep-rooted, had no place in the modern world. William knew his obligation was clear. Ruth and Ruby needed to be arrested, tried, and prevented from continuing that bloody tradition. But he also knew it wouldn't be simple. They wouldn't surrender easily, not when they believed they were fulfilling an ancient purpose. Edmund suddenly raised his hand for absolute silence. His trained hunters, he had picked up something the others hadn't yet noticed. There were sounds coming from the passage they'd entered. Sounds of movement, of light but deliberate footsteps on stone. Someone was coming toward them. Someone who knew these passages perfectly and moved with the confidence of someone in familiar territory. The four men quickly turned off their flashlights, plunging the chamber into near darkness. Only a faint glow came from the passageway, a gradually approaching light, accompanied now by female voices echoing eerily through stone. William couldn't make out any words, but the tone was calm, conversational. Two identical voices alternating in a conversation sounding almost musical in the way they intertwined. The group positioned themselves in the deepest shadows of the chamber, holding their breath, hands on their weapons, but hesitant to use them. They were in unfamiliar territory, in the twins' sanctuary, where any confrontation would be deeply disadvantageous. The light in the passage grew brighter, and now they could hear words clearly. Ruth and Ruby were talking about medicinal plants they'd collected, about a deer they'd seen near the stream, about how autumn was coming early this year. The twins entered the chamber carrying oil lanterns casting flickering yellow light. They stopped abruptly when they realized something was different, their sharp instincts immediately detecting signs of intrusion. Ruth pointed to the table where William had been shuffling the diaries, where the candles were positioned slightly differently. Ruby turned her head slowly, scanning every corner of the chamber, with eyes seeming capable of penetrating shadows themselves. William Hargrove knew there was no point in remaining hidden. He turned on his flashlight and stepped forward, revealing his presence. The twins showed no surprise or fear, only a kind of calm resignation, as if they'd always known this moment would eventually arrive. They placed their flashlights on the ground and stood side by side, identical in posture and expression, awaiting what would come next. The sheriff spoke first, his voice echoing strangely in the underground chamber. He said he knew what they'd been doing, that he'd found the evidence, the bodies, the diaries. He said they'd have to return with him to face justice for their crimes. Ruth and Ruby exchanged glances, a silent communication passing between them. And then Ruby answered, her voice surprisingly soft and polite. She explained they didn't understand, that they couldn't understand because they didn't carry the Guardians' blood. She said the mountains were ancient, older than any laws written by men in distant chambers, that there were pacts made when the world was young, agreements between the land and those who inhabited it, promises transcending generations. Ruth added they hadn't chosen this path, but they also couldn't reject it without bringing calamity upon all who lived in those mountains. William Hargrove listened to the twins' words with a mix of disbelief and profound sadness. He was a practical man, shaped by war and years of facing the harsh realities of the mountains. But even so, he sensed something genuine in their conviction. They weren't mad in the conventional sense, nor did they display the disconnect with reality he'd seen in other criminals. Instead, there was a disturbing clarity in their eyes, an unshakable certainty about their purpose making everything even more unsettling. Edmund Price and the two miners remained tense, ready to act if the twins tried to flee or attack, but Ruth and Ruby showed no intention of physical resistance. They seemed to have accepted this chapter of their lives was coming to an end, though that didn't mean they agreed with the legitimacy of the authority the men represented. Ruby continued speaking, her voice maintaining that calm, almost educational tone, as if explaining complex concepts to people who didn't yet have the capacity to fully grasp them. She told them the first guardian, whose true name was lost in the mists of time, had been a woman among the native people who inhabited these mountains long before European settlers arrived. This woman had given birth to twins during a harsh winter when the tribe was dying of hunger and disease. Desperate, she'd taken the babies into the sacred caves, places where the elders said the spirits of the mountains lived. There, according to legend passed down through generations, she'd made a pact. Her daughters and all the twins who came after them would protect the secrets of the mountains, maintain the balance between the world of the living and the world of the underworld, and in exchange, the tribe would survive. Ruth took over the story where her sister left off, explaining that when European settlers arrived, bringing new diseases and conflicts, most of the native peoples were wiped out or driven away. But one of the guardians of that generation had married a settler, a man who respected the ancient traditions and accepted his own twin daughters would carry on the legacy. Through the centuries, the bloodline persisted, sometimes through native blood, sometimes through settler families, but always maintaining the essence of the original pact. William asked directly about the men who'd died, Thomas Whitmore, Marcus Peyton, and all the others whose remains lay in that burial chamber beyond the underground river. He demanded to know why these specific people had been chosen, what criteria they used to decide who would live and who would die. The twins exchanged another look, loaded with silent communication, before answering. Ruby explained they didn't choose arbitrarily. There were signs they learned to recognize as children,